Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, YouTube. Hello, life in 3D, real human beings who we have in the room here at Edinburgh College of Arts, Westcourt. I'm really, really excited to be welcoming you all to tonight's event. In fact, this is the first of two. We've got a concert starting now where Plus Minus Ensemble and Matthew Shlomowitz will deliver the lecture about bad music. And after that, we'll be hearing from Raw Green Rust, Mariam Ritzai, and Gerard Roma with some fabulously rich and glitchy new music. So take an hour off to let yourself recover from what you learned from this lecture, and then come back and listen to some fabulous noises at 9 o'clock. Now, as sort of host for tonight, I get to say a bunch of thank yous, which, whilst that may seem like a fairly perfunctory act, is actually incredibly important because there's so many people that have been involved in making tonight's event and all the events of this week happen. They really need to be, they need their names calling out and the credit given. So I'm going to say some thank yous. First of all, to Moira Landals, who has brought that piano in from Allison House. We thanked her last night, but I want to thank her again tonight. It's not easy to move those things. She didn't lift it herself, obviously, but the logistics of getting the thing over into this room are quite extraordinary. And then Carolyn Mason, who has helped me with paying people. Again, this sort of stuff that goes on in the background, it really needs to be sort of recognized as a part of the thing that makes a festival happen. Now, around us are cables and speakers and microphones and cameras, and in fact, while it may not look that complex from where you're sitting in your living rooms, this is perhaps the most complex and technically ambitious series of events we've ever done because of the live streaming that's involved. There are so many different components and pieces of technology here in the room to make this happen. Therefore, it's really important to thank all the people who've been pulling all of that together. So I know you're itching to play, but I have to say this. Thank you very much to Roderick Buchanan Dunlop and Louis McHugh, who are up at the back there making sure the stream is working. Enormous thanks to Owen Green and P.H. Wembley, who are sitting in the desk making everything sound incredibly nice in the room. And because we've got lots of gigs this week, I can thank some other people in introducing those. So, without further ado, this is Dialogues, gig 2 of a number this week. Here is the Plus Minus Ensemble with Matthew Shlomowitz to deliver their lecture about bad music. Welcome.
recreating an experiment the German psychologist Max Meyer conducted in 1903. You've now heard the same terrible piece of music 3 times. You should have hated it the first time you heard it, but according to the results of the original experiment, you should have felt increasing pleasure with each successive performance. This should have helped you gradually revise your opinion of the piece in a positive direction. In psychology, this phenomenon, the phenomenon of first hating something, but then coming to like it through repeated experience, is known as the exposure effect. Can we say a piece of music is inherently bad, or are all such judgments purely subjective? Historically, this question has been addressed in terms of beauty. One of the big questions within the philosophical field of aesthetics is, can something be inherently beautiful? The classical philosophers believed in objective beauty. They believed a thing will be beautiful if the parts are organised to form a coherent whole and according to certain values regarding proportion, harmony, and symmetry. An example of an appealing proportion is the ratio found in the golden section, a point we will reach later in this lecture. The inference is that if you make something that adheres to these values, then beauty can reliably be achieved. But the notion of objective beauty was discredited during the 18th century. For instance, the philosopher Edmund Burke formulated the following example. A swan has a very long neck. A medium-sized body, and a tiny tail. Burke asks, is this a beautiful proportion? It must be, because everyone thinks that swans are beautiful. But this is pretty confusing, as everyone also thinks that peacocks are beautiful. And peacocks have got a pretty short neck an average sized body, and a tail that's longer than the neck and body combined. Swan. Peacock. Swan. Peacock. Swan and peacock. Does that simply mean that there is no objective basis to our judgments? We're going to return to that question later. But now let's go back to the music that you heard at the beginning. I composed that music especially for this lecture. I tried to write a piece that had no inherently positive attributes. If I were successful, you should have experienced no pleasure the first time that you heard it. But equally, according to the exposure effect, you should have begun experiencing a little pleasure when you heard the piece a second time, and that amount of pleasure should have increased with each repetition. An interesting aspect of Max Meyer's experiment is that it raises the question, what constitutes bad music? I found it harder than I had expected to compose a bad piece, a piece that would give you, the audience, no feelings of pleasure. I began with the following proposition. Music is inherently bad when it has no order. I set about composing music on my computer by assembling unrelated musical ideas in a random way. I wrote a bunch of pieces and I played the pieces from my computer to friends to get some feedback. They told me the pieces weren't that bad, and that they did perceive order and even a sense of cause and effect. I suppose the explanation is that our brains are wired up to look for and even construct a sense of cause and effect, even when it's not there. So here's one of the pieces that I composed for the beginning, but decided not to use. In that piece, I tried to compose musical ideas that lacked salience. By salience, I mean that the ideas lacked definition, identity, that they lacked noteworthy or memorable features. And I tried to make it unfocused and lacking in purpose. But I decided not to use that piece because I got worried that the piece might in fact have a very strong sense of focus and purpose in expressing a state of confusion. After all, how can we tell the difference between a piece that is just confused from one that has the aesthetic goal of expressing a state of confusion? And as I listened to the various bad pieces I'd written over and over again, I also became increasingly fond of them. I realised that as the composer, I was not immune from the exposure effect. I could not put myself back in the shoes of someone hearing these pieces for the first time. So in the end, the one that I chose for the start of this lecture seemed to me the one that was just most clearly simply bad. I think it's bad by virtue of the fact that one can imagine that with some adjustments, it could sound good. So in the end, the piece I chose is not bad because of its lack of order, its lack of salient features or focus. It's just bad because it's incompetent. Another reason a piece might be inherently bad is because it's overly repetitive. In the field of psychological aesthetics, there's a theory called processing fluency, which refers to the ease with which information is processed. The ability to process information fluently gives us pleasure. In turn, a highly repetitive work will produce a positive reaction. This pleasure, however, will be short-lived, as once the listener knows what's going on, boredom sets in and a negative reaction results. The state of diminished interest is called habituation. David Huron proposes that highly repetitive musical works will be experienced positively if that repetition is offset with a small degree of variation. So the next piece has a large amount of repetition to engender in you the positive feelings that result from processing fluency, whilst there is a small degree of variation, and that should defer any negative feelings that would result from the onset of habituation. Another way that David Huron suggests that a composer can maintain listener interest with a minimum of compositional effort is through the occasional deployment of novelty. Within this highly repetitive context, novel musical ideas will now be introduced at strategic moments to make sure that you do not succumb to habituation. let's now return to a state of pure repetition. Huron proposes that after a number of repetitions, listeners are going to habituate, and in turn responsiveness and pleasure will decline. On the face of it, that does seem totally reasonable, but let's now consider this statement. Excessive repetition is an invitation to listen in. A purely repetitive work may lead listeners to a state of disinterestedness, but we can also imagine a listener who becomes highly interested in the way that the musical idea resonates in the space in which it's being performed. Highly interested in the small details within the musical idea that they might have missed the first 10 times, including incidental sounds such as that of the guitarist's hand moving up and down the instrument's neck. This person might also tune into non-sonic aspects, such as studying the way that the musicians communicate with one another. Such a listener might note that in this context of extreme repetition, one element that does sometimes change is the facial expressions of the musicians. A reflective person might also pause to appreciate the physical feat involved in performing such vigorous music over and over again. One of the notes in that melody may have caused a degree of irritation. The unexpected note choice is likely to have been surprising. The moment's not really bad, it's more puzzling. And although puzzling moments are often experienced negatively, they also have a positive potential since they attract our attention and interest. If this melody came back later in the piece, this puzzling deviation could be resolved, which in turn would give you pleasure. If a piece didn't resolve a moment of deviance, if it just simply continued without any further reference to that deviance, then I think we could make a strong argument that the piece was bad, since that transgressive note was meaningless beyond simply being a moment of deviance. The note would be so puzzling that we might even conclude that the performers had just simply made a mistake. That example also had a moment of deviance, but that deviant moment was much weirder. It was what we might call stylistic transgression. So far we've considered the matter of bad music primarily from a psychological perspective. We've explored whether an understanding of our mental processes can provide an objective basis for our judgments. But the factors that shape our mental processes are much broader than we have acknowledged. We're now going to look at why a piece of music might produce different reactions and what role context plays in our judgments. Imagine a continuation of that piece, which attempted to reconcile this stylistic transgression. Attempting to make sense of that heavy metal confusion would indeed be an ambitious piece. If the piece did in some sense pull it off, that really would be something. But even if it did pull it off, there are still lots of people who wouldn't like it, no matter how good and successful it was. To explore this, let's now consider 3 hypothetical individuals.
My hypothetical name is Julia. I quite like the melody in that piece. But for me, the inclusion of heavy metal was an immediate turn-off. I think heavy metal is too loud, too aggressive, and I associate it with satanic worship. I feel quite negatively about satanic worship.
My hypothetical name is Roger. I have made a firm and exclusive commitment to blues music. I believe blues is the highest form of music because it is improvised, it is expressive, and it deals with personal woes in a harsh world. The idea of a piece that tries to reconcile 2 different styles of music just seems bad to me. It has no lyrics, and it just sounds like an academic exercise. I think music should be about the expression of feelings.
Most of Roger's friends are also blues enthusiasts, and their love of blues music is a very important part of their social identity, pride, and self-esteem. According to Henry Tushfell's social identity theory, in order to increase our sense of self-image, we enhance the status of our group to which we belong, and this involves discriminating against other groups. The world is divided into us and them through a process of social, or in this case, aesthetic categorization. We all do it.
My hypothetical name is Catherine. I don't like the idea of that piece because I believe in stylistic purity. I will concede that the whole idea of mixing styles was historically important during the heyday of postmodernism, but ultimately it was a dead end. And doing it now is just dated.
My hypothetical name is Panthera Leo. I may not know what music is, but I feel there's nothing more musical than what you hear when you sit down in the African savannah. You really shouldn't talk about music, either good or bad, until you hear that sublime sound from my birthplace.
The exposure effect is a theory that tries to explain why we may positively revise our opinion of a musical piece. David Huron argues that exposure alone does not provide the full explanation. He argues that we like music when it gives us pleasure, and that being able to predict what happens next in a piece gives us pleasure. When we are unable to predict what will happen next in a musical piece, we don't experience pleasure, and in turn, we don't like the piece. But if we hear that piece a number of times, we can learn to predict what will happen next, which gives us pleasure, and in turn, leads us to change our opinion. So David Huron proposed the experiment that you've just heard, which consisted of 5 short sound events. There was A, B, C, D, and E. Those 5 elements, those 5 sound events, were randomly organised aside from 2 stipulations. The first was that A occurred far more frequently than the other sound events. The second stipulation was that every time D appeared, it was followed by E. So the order of the sound events was completely random aside from this one condition that every time D appears, it always led to E. Huron's argument is that if the degree of exposure was the most important factor in listener pleasure, then sound event A would have given you the most pleasure, as that was the element that you were most exposed to. You heard A 19 times, whereas none of the others appeared more than 8 times. But Huron suggests that you are likely not to have received the most pleasure from A, but rather from E, as that was the only element that you could learn to anticipate. You could learn to successfully predict that each time you heard D, that E would come next. And the point is that this ability to successfully make a prediction produces pleasure. It's a great experiment, but surely other factors are also at play. Perhaps you liked element C the best, because you thought C sounded cool. Or perhaps something in it reminded you of a song that you heard on your first date with your current partner in a Thai restaurant. So we're now repeating the experiment again, but now with A, B, C, D, and E, just each represented by a single pitch. The same rules apply. A is appearing the most often. You can hear it played on the violin. And whenever D appears on the synthesizer, it's always followed by E, which is played by the electric guitar. In this final part, we are returning to the opening to create a rounded form. In his practical guide to music composition, Professor Alan Belkin suggests that a rounded form can convincingly conclude a piece through providing the listener with a sense of stability, relaxation, and closure. This textbook view of composition taps into the values of proportion, harmony, and symmetry from the classical philosophers that we considered earlier. In creating a symmetrical relationship with the opening, I'm hoping to create a sense of tension between good and bad practice. As although this rounded form here is good practice, the music is still bad. But in the end, can we say that this music, or any music, is bad? That's the question we posed at the start, and from everything we've considered in this lecture, it seems like we've got to conclude that evaluating music is a purely subjective act. And yet David Huron argues that musical pieces can be objectively bad. Take the example of this music that you are listening to now. Huron might argue this music is bad. Yes, you've come to like it, but that's simply because of the pleasure you're now experiencing in being able to successfully predict what will come next. It doesn't mean it's good. You are confused. This is a classic case of what psychologists call misattribution. What's going on here is that you are attributing the pleasure that you are experiencing from the music when really the award for the pleasure should go to the mental circuit that's formed in your brain that's enabled you to make the successful predictions. That's a pretty amazing thought, but it's also troubling. For how can we tell the difference between the pleasure that we experience from good music and the misattributed pleasure that we experience from bad music?
haven't been told you were going to play a piece of music too. That random hand clapping piece that you've just done. Did you compose this, Matthew? No?
Didn't.
So, I wonder what music is, and it was Matthew's talk. Is that part of music? What did you learn? So I'd like to open up to the floor. If anyone could tell me what music is, what did you learn? Anyone?
I'll say something. Music for me is something that happens inside.
Music happens inside.
Not inside a building, I mean inside me.
Inside you. What does that actually mean?
I was hoping you were going to spring into life and tell me what that meant. Like, oh yeah.
Oh yeah. And should I feel something? Also, I know there are people watching this on YouTube. You can comment.
The people on YouTube are about 30 seconds behind us right now.
Oh, right, so they're in the past.
They'll spring into life in a second. I can read
Okay.
out some comments if you like.
They're still seeing the bow. Okay.
They can see
They'll
you talking
catch up
now.
soon. So,
Yeah.
please, live people. Which part of music did you like best?
I have a comment.
Yes?
One thing I found very interesting was the observation that a composer's not immune to this exposure effect, which I think is very interesting for those of us that create music. And maybe with the current technology that's available, listening back to what we've created maybe too many times, maybe so many times in wanting to question, am I happy with this? Perhaps that perspective is being distorted. I find that very interesting, quite complicated idea, which is not something I've thought about before.
So Justin was saying, composer is not immune to this exposure effect. Composer listening, thanks to technology, listening to the piece they composed too many times, and then they just get confused. Is that right? Yes, please.
I liked the bad music best. And I liked the bad music best because it was very structural and undecorated. It was kind of slabs, it was planes of sound. And these kind of planes of sound were just kept coming in a very regular, ordered fashion.
Okay, so he likes the bad music because it's kind of rough and pushy. Am I right?
No, actually, I found it quite, it wasn't rough and pushy. I actually found it really, there was kind of the strata in there, but each time it's kind of the same, but each time different. And so, there's just this kind of layers to it. It's like, I don't know, a sandwich, and each time you have a bite of a sandwich, you taste one of the fillings slightly more than another one. It was the same filling, but each time it was different.
All right. Is it like a sand in the sandwich so that you can really feel it?
Well, yeah, I could really feel it because, like Martin, it kind of happens inside me too. Like it's not quite synesthesia, but it's a cognitive act.
May I ask, when does a bad piece of music stops being music? What does it happen? Could a piece of music be so bad that it's no longer music?
For me, no.
Oh.
So are you asking us what we think music is? Because that puts a parameter around it, right? When
Who's
it stops.
speaking? Oh, sorry.
Not the internet, no, this is me speaking. So do you mean you need us to know what music is and what music isn't, and that helps us?
Well, that's as a lion, that's my fundamental question. What is the music? I think the sound I grew up with is slightly more musical sometimes. Tonight? Is it a right thing to say, or is it an insult? Oh. Shall we move on?
Okay. The internet said that they love the guitar shredding, so kudos. Woo! Oh, and also the internet said, I like the guitar, but clarinet is still better.
Are you related to the person, do you think? No, of course not.
Someone also said they were glad that the lion wasn't conducting.
Wasn't conducting?
Yes.
That is an insult, isn't it?
And they were worried that you might be taking the microphone off to cash converters later, because you ran off the
Thank you very much.
But you brought it back, so thank you.
Lionel,
Yes.
when you started dancing, was that because you liked music?
That's a good question. I like the rhythm, the music. Potentially, yes. I think I start because it's repeated so many times. By the end of it, I started to I learned it a little bit, and then I think that yes, that's called exposure effect, doesn't it? Lions are not immune either. Yes, please.
When does rhythm become music?
When does
rhythm become music?
When does rhythm become music? Everybody's very philosophical. How about you, Matthew? You composed this.
When does rhythm become music? I think that rhythm is music.
Rhythm is already music.
To me,
I mean, rhythm needs to have something.
when there's a rhythm, I start dancing. What happened tonight? And then we actually did a rehearsal. After 3 rehearsals, I started to hum. That's when it becomes music, I would say. How's that?
Start singing it.
That's not humming. Right. Any more from internet or anyone else? Or shall we go to the bar?
There was just another comment that perhaps composing is best. Of all the instruments, composing is the best one.
Better than clarinet.
Even better. Yeah.
Better than lion. Do you accept that?
Guess you need composers to play the trumpet.
Oh, industrial hierarchy. Okay. Shall we?
That's a good beer. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.